The Beast of Bury. The brutal slaying and mutilation that went unsolved for 12 years. A Who Dunnit special. On a winter's night, January the 6th, 1994, one of the most horrific and brutal murders was committed in the quiet town of Bury, on the River Irwell in the Metropolitan Borough of Bury, Greater Manchester, England. And even with the killer's DNA being left on the scene, this awful slaying remained unsolved for 12 whole years until the killer made a fatal error. This episode contains details of one of the most dreadful and atrocious crimes ever committed. Viewer discretion is advised. It's around 4 a.m. the morning of the 7th of January 1994, and a couple from the local area were returning from a night out and decided to stop off and use the public toilet facilities at the Bury bus station interchange. But when the female entered the toilet available, she was met with the most sickening and nightmarish scene, complete and utter horror. A lady, completely naked, barely recognisable, lay face up in the cubicle, bloodied, bruised and visually mutilated, including the removal of her right breast. Just an unimaginable scene to try and comprehend for anyone. By early morning, the bus station was swarming with police and forensic investigators who had to work fast to not only contain the scene, but to work through all of the evidence left behind in this grotty public toilet. You can only imagine what was in there. Besides the gory evidence the murderer had left behind, who knows when it was last cleaned? Fingerprints and bodily fluids would have been everywhere. Plus, logistically, how contained and claustrophobic almost that this crime scene was. It was just an absolute nightmare to try and search through and recover vital evidence of this woman's horrifying death. This one's going to be a long one, guys, so get your tea ready and let's dive in. Police combed through anything and everything they came across in the cubicle, not knowing what would be important to the case. Everything mattered. A piece of chewing gum, a cigarette bud, it was all taken. What seemed to be body tissue was recovered on the outside of the toilet cubicle door, which through further investigations and expert determinations, it showed that the perpetrator of this horrific slaying and mutilation must have actually been holding the woman's severed breast as he exited the cubicle and in turn left behind an imprint of her breast tissue. Above the found imprint of body tissue, crime scene investigators also found there to be blood, which could have only been left there at the same time as the breast tissue imprint. Some parallel scoring around where the breast was removed was found on the body. Also at the scene was a piece of broken glass, perhaps a glass bottle, and this piece of glass was found to have some of the victim's flesh around it, showing an initial attempt at using this to remove the breast, but this seemed to have been unsuccessful and was actually removed with an other unknown sharp cutting tool not found on the scene. The other thing not found on the scene, or anywhere else in fact, was the severed breast itself, never recovered. So who was this woman, taken in the most unthinkable way? A post-mortem would reveal the horrific extent of her injuries and mutilations. The pathologist who performed the post-mortem on the unknown victim stated that due to the lack of blood loss at the scene, concerning specifically the removal of the breast, showed it had to be removed between half an hour up to 2 full hours after she had been murdered. So, did the criminal remain on the scene after they had committed such an horrific, brutal attack for all of that time? Perhaps they were trying to formulate a plan to remove the breast. Did they just lurk around at the crime scene, enjoying what they had just done? It really wasn't that late when the murder was expected to have taken place, which was around 9:15 p.m. in a bus station with constant foot traffic. Extremely brazen behaviour from the perpetrator of this monstrous crime. The toilet in which the murder took place was apparently the only cubicle available for use at that time of night, as the other toilets were said to have been blocked off after a certain time, so the only cubicle to use was the one the lady's body lay slain in. So did they stay on the scene for all of that time, knowing anyone could enter at any moment and catch them in the act? Or did they leave the scene to equip themselves with the correct implement to achieve the gruesome removal? CCTV was not all that advanced back then, and still in its early stages, and mainly used on buildings such as banks, somewhere with money to protect. So CCTV did not provide much in this case and actually hindered it, ultimately focusing on the wrong people. The pathologist who examined the body also found bruising around the victim's neck and damage to her vagus nerve. Her cause of death was listed as manual compression of the neck, so asphyxiation, I believe. It took around 14 hours to determine who the victim was of the sickening attack. Her name was Shirley Leach, and she was actually a 66-year-old widower. So why was this 66-year-old lady on her own on a winter's evening? Shirley was at the Barry bus station that night because she had been visiting her daughter Beryl in Fairfield Hospital, located not all that far from the Barry interchange. Visiting times were around 7 to 8 p.m, so she was estimated to have left around 8 p.m. That night, Shirley had been visiting her daughter, accompanied by her grandson, Darren Linton, who was very close with his grandmother, expressing how they loved to visit music stores together, and he said how she knew more about the modern music at that time than he did. She sounded like one hip grandma. After their visit to the Fairfield Hospital, the two decided to stop off at the pub nearby and have a drink or two before setting off for home. Shirley supposedly lived with her son Gary, so her grandson did not reside with her. The grandma and grandson then caught a bus called the 469, which took them into Barry Interchange. Shirley's grandson Darren would depart on his way home in a different direction, as they both expected Shirley to soon take her usual bus back home, the 474. She was seen at Barry bus station alive and well around 9 p.m. by a couple of nurses who had also travelled back from Fairfield's hospital and had recognised the unmissable, bright and spunky 66-year-old Shirley Leach. Unfortunately, when Shirley arrived at the station, after her grandson had departed, she was informed that the next bus would be delayed, even up to 40 minutes. And this very delay is what would lead Shirley Leach to enter those ladies' toilets that tragic night in 1994. With the assumption she needed to relieve herself after the drink at the pub, she was also known to have a weak bladder. Usually she may have waited until she arrived home to use the toilet, but given that she may have been facing a delay of up to 40 minutes, she had ultimately decided to use the only toilet available and met her death. Shirley Leach, a 66-year-old loving grandmother, plus much more to her community, known as the sweet lady who used to always offer food and drinks to her neighbours and children of the area, like lemonade and sandwiches. Yet she was not afraid to tell the young boys off when they would play in the bushes in her garden. A confident yet kind lady. She was widowed in 1992 after losing her beloved husband, Ronnie. Since then, Shirley did seem to keep herself to herself, before loving nothing more than time with her family. Shirley had been visiting her daughter Beryl at the Fairfield Hospital for around 2 weeks before her murder, so she had made the same 2-bus journey each day for 2 weeks with no issues. But it was said she had previously been accompanied all of the way by a family member, but not that night. She was alone, leaving herself vulnerable to one of the most sadistic killers England has ever seen. Now back to the crime scene investigation, and given there was not much blood found after the murder, i.e. the breast removal, but there had been a clear blood sample left behind with the breast imprint, this meant it could be a huge breakthrough. Was this the killer's blood they had found? Well, it was not Shirley's blood. therefore did not match the breast tissue it was found with, showing this had to be the killer's DNA. Yes, it was gold dust, but they still had to match this blood with someone. Manchester and Greater Manchester devoted as much of their resources as possible into solving this extremely graphic and unexpected murder of an innocent old lady, devoting at least 50 main detectives to the case. Murder was not often heard in this quiet and mainly peaceful town of Bury, so the hunt was now on. Who done it? What kind of disturbed and sadistic human would commit such an unthinkable act? It was sadly also determined that Shirley Leach had been raped during the attack. What kind of beast was lurking on the streets of Bury? So it's evening on a Friday night back in 1994 at the fairly frequented Bury bus station interchange, seeing people from all over Manchester and of course further afield, people coming and going. It could be anyone from anywhere. Who would commit such a crime? Was it someone from far away who decided to fill their sickening urges and then flee on a bus to God knows where? Or could it be someone from the local area? As expected, the whole of Bury was completely rocked after learning about the disgusting and horrific details of Shirley's murder in such a public place. Would this beast act again? To me, given the appalling and grisly way this old lady had been taken advantage of and murdered, this certainly does not seem like this perpetrator's first time or first offence. It was way too gory and public. Remember how the pathologist said that the mutilation had taken place at least 30 minutes to 2 hours after the rape and murder was committed. This could be a sign that whoever this sick individual was, they could have actually resided much closer to the Bury area. As the evidence showed, it could be the killer had left the scene to retrieve the correct tool they needed to complete the job. Now, why on earth would this person want to first of all perhaps give themselves multiple chances of being caught by going back and forth from the crime scene at this very public place, but also make such a drastic effort to retrieve Shirley's breast? So guys, depending on how many murder documentaries and true crime shows you have all previously seen, you may be aware that many of these sick fucks decide to take a souvenir, a trophy of their despicable acts away with them for multiple reasons, like to relive the act later on alone, to carry on the enjoyment of their sick crimes. So could this be the reason the killer went to such an extent to take home a trophy? Could be. With the CCTV back then being almost pointless and the bus station only having one camera for the whole area, it did not unveil much. And as I said, just made people focus on the wrong individuals, including the police, making their jobs without the help from the CCTV all that much harder. After the atrocious crime took place, shops in the local area saw a surge of rape alarm sales, stemming from the terror of the public, knowing a killer was on the loose, still out there somewhere. And if they could commit such an unspeakable ghastly act to such an innocent old lady, what would they do next? With the forensic investigators still working diligently to find crucial evidence at the Bury bus station, onlookers who had gathered could physically see nearly everything that was happening. The bus station was all glass, and given the toilet was such a small area, being part of a much wider crime scene, full of potential evidence, every inch of the surrounding area had to be thoroughly worked over, like a fine-tooth comb. And all of this would be witnessed by many people. You cannot hide behind an all-glass building. The forensic investigators were seen searching the bins and the grids, and removing all kinds of potential important evidence from the scene, including at some point Shirley's mutilated body. So with it now being morning, people were arriving to work or to use the buses, but were instead faced with forensic investigators. Clear panic would ensue as everyone could see this was no ordinary crime. Bury Interchange had been very busy the previous night, so police worked fast to interview and clear as many of these people as possible, Physically having the DNA of the killer made this easier, but certainly not easy back then. Many different sightings were reported to police from the night in question, which of course all were looked into. They worked their way through everyone, checking off each person one by one using the vital DNA. But in the early stages of the investigation, there had been one very important witness statement, and this was given by a young girl who was travelling alone on the Bury interchange that night in 1994. She was waiting for her bus when she would come across a strange man who persisted to approach and bother her, asking for things like a cigarette, which to me shows he was not trying to flirt with her and get to know this girl. He was trying to get her to drop her guard, perhaps waiting for his perfect opportunity to strike. The girl was so concerned about the strange individual continuing to approach her, she actually decided to not remain at the station and catch a bus, but instead called for a taxi. This girl could have genuinely saved her own life that night by making that critical decision. So possibly 66-year-old Shirley Leach was not the intentional original victim that night, showing this killer did not care what age his victim was. He just needed to fulfill his sick needs and fantasies. The young girl who came forward and reported this man she had met to the police, she had managed to describe him in such detail that specialists could put together this e-fit of a suspect, which seems quite detailed to me. He somehow, even though the sketch is grey, appears to have blonde or at least light-coloured hair. His features are very detailed, with his flat mouth being quite prominent, showing he may completely lack of emotion. The hair being this certain length just sticking out. I really feel like this is blonde hair from the sketch. I hope that they pointed out this when they released the e-fit, as some people may not realise from the grey sketch how light this person's hair is. And then there is the hat, just ruffled up. Sort of like a workman's hat, but a soft one, like a beanie style hat, I'd describe it as. So not exactly an industrial job, but perhaps some sort of outside line of work. This very e-fit will become striking once the killer is finally caught, with quite an extreme likeness at the time. It seemed this murder was completely random, and not by someone Shirley knew personally, as investigators would work their way through using the DNA to check off everyone who she knew off the list of suspects. Instead, this murder seemed more like a crime of opportunity, as in just someone the killer came across at random and instinctively selected, rather than a planned murder where the victim was targeted specifically. Showing this sick bastard really did not have a type, making investigators' jobs even harder with no base to go off. Sex offenders in the area were obviously looked into and eliminated. A male who committed a sex offence, also in a bus station in Lancashire, around 40 to 50 minutes from Bury, who was known to have used the Bury interchange on that very night, at the specific time frame that the murder was suspected to have taken place. Thinking they had found their man, police would hunt him down, but ultimately using the DNA would also eliminate him too. So, who done it? Who was the beast of Bury? The small town saw sales diminish after the traumatising event, and all local businesses suffered. A cafe situated right by the public toilets, which actually opened the next day, by the way. Just imagine how scary that was for the staff there. Before the murder, they would always serve food through an open window hatch to the public, but afterwards it was decided to keep the hatch closed for the safety of the people working there and the visiting the cafe. Women were told to stay in groups, which is always a worry. But I mean, this sickening murder and mutilation of an innocent old lady, I don't think you can specify women. I believe that everyone should have been worried about this sicko. Panic and fright would persist throughout the residents of Bury as the killer stayed at large, and Shirley's case remained as an open and active investigation, so police never gave up on Shirley Leach and finding her killer. DNA profiling was still in its infancy, even over the following years that this barbaric, perverted killer was still on the streets, somewhere, anywhere. Investigators looking at the crime really did not have much at all to go on to narrow down the suspects, as again, this freak did not seem to have a type. Although they had the crucial DNA, it was an early profile and there was no database available like we have today to compare it to. They needed a direct comparison to catch the killer. 14 months later and over 500 people checked against the blood DNA found on the crime scene, and yet still no closer to finding Shirley's vicious attacker. Hope for finding this person was fading, but technology was thankfully evolving, and by 1995 the national database had begun erupting. So any DNA selected and put into this database could be accessed and cross-referenced with the killer's blood. Tens of thousands of men could now be screened who had been entered in through England and Wales. Suddenly, hope was rising again in this case. Familial DNA was also now a thing, as Shirley's murder remained an open, active investigation. This was soon put to use, and a lot of painstaking investigative work would ensue. But years and years would pass by without any hopes of hunting down the beast of Bury. Over time, England began to start inputting any and all criminals' DNA into the national database, whatever crime they had committed when arrested, and this decision would help solve so many other more serious crimes. And that is what happened in this very case. A prolonged 12 years had passed since the beast of Bury had unleashed on an innocent grandmother in the public toilets of the bus station back in 1994. So, how were they finally captured, and what have they been doing in all of the years since that dark, disturbing night? Some believed he must have been in prison, or just moved somewhere else completely. It's now 18th of February 2006, and Shirley's killer is about to make a huge mistake. Police who were patrolling in their vehicles in the area of Moston in North Manchester, around 20 minutes from Bury, would witness a male driving erratically and attracting attention, so suspected him of drink driving. They took a standard roadside breathalyzer test, and along with the now routinely taken mouth swabs, which were entered into the national DNA database. The individual at the time was charged with drink driving and then bailed. This 37-year-old was called IanO'Callaghan. In 1994, Ian had been a shift supervisor at a roadside furniture factory, a place that would make, say, like the roadworks you see and the cones and signs used to point them out. That's what I mean, that kind of stuff. So was this just a normal guy who made the mistake of drink driving that day, or was the 37-year-old male holding down a good job something more sinister? If you guessed the latter, you would be right. IanO'Callaghan would have been 25 years old back in 1994 when the horrific slaying took place. He at the time had a girlfriend who was now his wife at this point. They also had a young child together. He lived around 20 to 40 minutes away from Bury Interchange and was said to frequent the area. He was apparently in the Territorial Army Reserves or linked to them somehow, so would often visit the barracks nearby. Police missed him completely, as IanO'Callaghan seemed to be the sort of grey man in the later years since the murder, not someone who stood out, blending in almost with society. And that is the scariest part, how someone could commit such horror and then return home and continue to lead what from the outset seemed to be a completely normal life. He resided in a lovely part of Manchester and seemed to not attract much attention. Described as a normal and really good lad by a work colleague. But there was one alarming thing that Ian would often be seen doing, and that was how he constantly would sharpen his work knives, like almost an obsession. Even when they appeared as sharp as they could get, he would continue, to the point where his colleagues would often comment, "Look at him, he's at it again, trying to get his knife sharp." He was always seen doing this. Just picturing that feels sinister to me. The interesting part of this job was how the workers at the end of their shifts would always take 2 things home with them so as to not get them stolen. And these 2 things were the gloves they would wear and the extra sharp, small knives that they used to trim the rubber around the traffic cones. The very knives that IanO'Callaghan was constantly, obsessively seen sharpening. A tool, an implement that would be perfect to use when trying to sever a human body. Oh yeah, and Ian would often be seen wearing a soft beanie-style hat that he always wore slightly ruffled up with his hair poking out of the sides, light-coloured hair. He has fairly prominent features with a flat, emotionless mouth. The e-fit that one young girl provided to the police of the strange man she had encountered on the Bury bus station that fateful night back in 1994 literally fitted. IanO'Callaghan is the Beast of Bury. The striking likeness between Ian, aged 25, on his passport at the time, compared to the e-fit supplied was uncanny, surprisingly good. This shows just how normal of a life Ian had managed to uphold all of those 12 long years, by never raising suspicions from either his friends, family, co-workers, neighbours, or even police. With the extreme likeness and looks to the e-fit, and the job that saw him wear that very type of hat outdoors, and who was also seen constantly and obsessively sharpening small knives that he took home with him each night, that were perfect for mutilation, still no one suspected him. The results from the suspected drink driver in the Manchester area had finally, after 12 excruciatingly long years, with no justice for Shirley Leach and all of her loved ones, found a positive result for Shirley's killer. It was a complete DNA match, the ultimate comparison. The Beast of Bury had been found. The blood taken from the scene that night, the blood that was located along with Shirley's breast tissue in the toilet, was a complete match to the now 37-year-old IanO'Callaghan. Eventually, after more than a decade, this revolting, disturbing human being had been apprehended, and not just for drink driving, but this time for the outrageous murder and mutilation of 66-year-old Shirley Leach from all the way back in 1994. Success. Eventually. IanO'Callaghan was arrested at his home at 6:20 a.m, completely surprised when he opened the door that morning, only to be met with the murder charges. His wife, startled by the commotion downstairs, soon appeared, and Ian was heard shouting, "It's a mistake!" I wonder if he thought he'd gotten away with it and would never be captured after such a long time. Or did he spend every day of every year looking over his shoulder, wondering when they would come for him? He may have chosen to lay low since he committed such a public and egregious crime, or he could have been attacking women all over Manchester in all these years. Unsolved crimes. Who knows? But Shirley Leach's death was way too public, extreme, and graphic in nature to ever be this man's first offence. No chance. I still cannot believe just how brazen he was that Friday night, attacking early evening around 9:20 p.m. in a bus station and then proceeding to go back and forth to the crime scene in an area where many people could have easily seen him. Why would this seemingly normal guy with a girlfriend at 25 be somehow sexually attracted or motivated to rape, mutilate and murder an innocent 66-year-old lady he had never met? Well, as we all know from the young female who supplied that surprisingly perfect e-fit back in 94, Shirley perhaps was not specifically Ian's first choice as such, as in a type he wanted, but more for Shirley being in the wrong place, wrong time. A crime of opportunity by IanO'Callaghan. Police were completely astounded that this despicable killer had actually managed to lead a normal life with a full-time employment, living in a good area with a family of his own. But he isn't the only killer to succeed with this. John Wayne Gacy would act as a clown, literally. He would be hired to entertain at kids' parties dressed as one. He went on to rape, torture and murder at least 33 young boys and men. Man, I hate clowns. Then we have Ted Bundy, a college graduate and a volunteer at a suicide hotline, described by others who knew him as a charming man. He went on to murder more than 30 women in the 1970s and was unsuspected for so long due to his friendly and kind nature. What about Harold Shipman, the British doctor and serial killer, who played off being a normal member of staff, a general practitioner at a medical centre in West Yorkshire, England, where he targeted the vulnerable with lethal doses of diamorphine, and his victim count was estimated anywhere between 250 to 450 people. Just awful. It's crazy to think how all of these people, and God knows how many more, managed to lead such average lives, keep a home and a wife and children maybe, and hold down a good job, whilst on the side raping, torturing and murdering victim after victim. I mean, where did they find the time? So, when Ian was arrested for the murder, his home would subsequently be searched through for anything that could further link him to the horrendous crime. One such interesting find was from a bookcase in Ian's home, and this was a book called The Chronicle of Crime. Investigators would spend time sifting through this book, as clearly just the name says a lot and attracted their attention and interest during the search. And in this very book were details of a crime that took place back in the 1960s, where a man had been convicted of a murder through the use of odontology, which is the scientific study of the structure and diseases of teeth. In the Chronicle of Crime in the 1960s, the murderer was convicted because of a bite mark impression he had left on his victim's breast. Ringing lots of bells for investigators, it all started to come together. After Ian had brutally raped, murdered and mutilated Shirley, he had realised he had left his teeth mark impression on her breast, and after a failed attempt to sever the breast with the broken glass, probably found on the scene, Ian then made the extremely brazen decision to return to his home address and retrieve the perfectly sharpened small knives. He then shockingly returned to the crime scene, and using those exact knives, he removed the evidence from Shirley's lifeless body. The time that had passed had left her body to stop pumping blood, and rigor mortis to start setting in. That's why there wasn't blood when he was removing the breast. Any blood on the scene was from the original brutal attack on her, leaving Shirley unrecognisable. And it showed it obviously was the killer's sample of blood, or DNA, found near the breast imprint on the cubicle door, perhaps from cutting himself with those sharp knives, as Shirley had stopped bleeding by this point. Strange he didn't seem to be wearing his work gloves during the attack. Maybe they were too thick to feel through, or too hard to clean? Again, who knows? Or perhaps he was wearing them and cut himself through the gloves. So with what the pathologist had noted that the killer had removed the breast between half an hour to 2 hours before, it fitted with the scene and the narrative that was believed to have happened that night. Ian attempted to use the glass, which failed, but knowing that he had the perfect tools at home, he went back to get them, which if driving would take a minimum of 20 to 40 minutes, but of course on foot a lot longer. Time for rigor mortis of Shirley's body to start setting in. But because he chose to use such sharp knives, the ones he never stopped sharpening, remember, this was his ultimate downfall. Even if it took 12 years, using those knives caught him, as it seemed from the scene he had in turn cut himself during the terrifying assault. In doing so, he left the perfect DNA bloodstain profile left above the breast imprint on the back of the toilet door, from a supposed wound he inflicted on himself, most probably to his hand. This would be his downfall. In 2006, at Manchester Crown Court, the murder trial would commence, with the focus of the prosecution homing in on the 1 in a billion chance that the crucial blood DNA could be anyone else's but IanO'Callaghan's. The witness's e-fit match with Ian's passport at the time of the murder, when he was 25, was undeniable. Even Ian himself admitted it looked just like him, but refused to say he knew of Shirley, Well, yeah, I mean, she was a stranger. You clearly don't need to know someone to murder them, do you? Also adding that he wasn't at or near the Bury bus station that night. But clearly he was. I mean, you bled on the scene, man. Ain't no denying that. Shockingly, it was found that IanO'Callaghan had actually had a pretty dark past before his seemingly clean-cut family man persona that he had portrayed in the years since, even being convicted of previous sexual offences which dated all the way back to Ian's teenage years. A recent change in the law at the time allowed these previous offences to be examined in court. The Criminal Justice Act had been amended to allow what they call bad character reference to be used in trial if the judge agreed to it. The prosecution in Ian's murder case applied to have his past criminal history to be included, only if they were similar types of crimes. Ian had previous convictions of indecent exposure where he exposed himself in public to 3 young girls. He punched a random woman in a bar, knocking her unconscious. He'd also, when he was just 16 years old, broke into a 46-year-old woman's home and raped her right there and then in her own home. Why was this scumbag free, and since such a young age? The justice system is so flawed and always has been. The jury took 4 days to decide a verdict of guilty. IanO'Callaghan never showed an ounce of remorse throughout the trial and would never accept any accountability for his horrendous crimes. As he was led away in cuffs, he yelled, "I didn't do it." Deny till you die, is it, Ian? Clearly a compulsive liar. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 28 years. Again, in my opinion, life should be life. Oh, it wasn't over. Around 10 years after his conviction, another victim of Ian's who felt everything rush back to her when she saw his mugshot on TV, she would make the tough decision to come forward, claiming she had also been assaulted by Ian. It was around a time his job put him right back at Bury bus station, the scene of his horrific rape and mutilation and murder years before. This female, who was then 26 when she came forward, and only did so when she saw Ian was arrested and felt safe to do so. The female lived in Bury. She said she had been attacked and raped by Ian when she was an 11-year-old child. Ian at the time was a bus driver. He had just finished his shift. As he was walking home, he came across the young girl, who he had also known from working as a bus driver. He was said to have exposed himself to her, and then he attacked and brutally raped the poor girl, even threatening to actually murder her if she were to ever speak of it to anyone. She was so afraid, she continued on as normally as she could, even having to constantly face her rapist at his place of work every time she would visit the Bury bus station. The attack was said to have taken place in 2001, which was 7 years after Shirley's brutal murder. What other sick and twisted crimes has this man committed and gotten away with? In 2019, whilst already in prison, Ian would be re-arrested for this crime. He stood trial at Minshull Street Crown Court in Manchester, which of course, like before, he denied everything. It didn't matter, and Ian was further convicted of the rape and was told he would probably die in prison for his wicked crimes against innocent women. Because surely 28 years later after his murder conviction, when Ian will attempt for parole, they will examine his previous acts and never give it to him. Hopefully this disturbingly sadistic killer will die in prison. He deserves nothing less for the utter torture he brought upon not only Shirley Leach, but many others in the town of Bury, and also all of Shirley's loved ones left behind. This case, although unsolved for 12 years, just proves how important it is to continue to take all criminals' DNA when a crime is committed, no matter how small the offence. A drink driving charge led through the National DNA database was ultimately what found this twisted killer and helped bring him to justice. Many people may disagree, but I believe every criminal's DNA should be taken for this very reason. I hope you enjoyed this episode special of Who Dunnit, the Beast of Bury. I like to keep my episodes random like my name, but I'm also trying to find which you guys prefer to watch and what kind of style. I know my Defamed Stars Rolf Harris episode is very popular, reaching 8,500 views in around 6 months when I only have 557 subscribers. It's got around 119 likes and has had so much engagement through the comment section, with people sharing true stories of Rolf Harris experiences, that YouTube actually turned off my comments, which is extremely unfortunate given the amazing responses I had on there, never to be seen again. Oh well. I really appreciate all of your feedback and want to find out what you want to see more of. Is there a true crime or murder story you would like for me to cover, or any other defamed stars you would like me to focus on? Let me know your thoughts on this episode and any others in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching, following and subscribing to me. You can also find me on Facebook, Jen, in brackets, Random Jen, just to get a little bit more of a personal vibe from me. If you'd like to see sort of things I get up to and just humorous memes I share, just to get to know me a little better. Thank you all. Random Jen.